Hello and welcome to 7 Days in Europe. My studio guest, who I'm delighted to welcome, is such a committed European that he's won prizes for it. Well, awards of various kinds. He is Pat Cox, who was President of the European Parliament from January 2002 until July 2004. In many ways to his own surprise, as I recall, given that the two biggest political groups, the EPP and the Socialists, tend to play ping-pong with the job, taking turns at it. And Pat was leader of what was then the ELDR, the Liberal Democrat group. There's a lot to talk about, but first of all, it's our yes-no sequence in which I ask a series of questions to which I'd like you to answer only yes or no.
No.
Do you still believe in a European future?
Yes.
Do you think enough other people believe in it?
Yes.
Has Ireland's Euro enthusiasm faded a bit?
Not really.
Can the Celtic tiger roar again?
Hopefully not in the way it did before.
Are you worried by recent events in Turkey?
Now that the Prime Minister seems to be thinking that he should listen to the people a bit more, let's see.
OK. Will it damage, you think, their prospects of EU membership, though?
I think the EU has behaved disgracefully with regard to Turkey's membership negotiations, and it should be a lot more strategic than it has been.
OK. Are you worried by the growth of anti-immigration parties and attitudes?
Yes, frankly, I am.
The economic crisis, was austerity the right answer?
Rigour is necessary, but rigor mortis is not.
Is very high youth unemployment a long-term phenomenon, do you think?
It's hard to get rid of, but it's indispensable to do so.
OK. Well, our time is up for that, so thank you very much indeed. In a moment, we'll take a look at a short rundown of the week's news. But before we do you think the economic crisis and the EU's somewhat headless chicken reaction to it has damaged support for the European ideal across Europe?
There's no doubt, if you look at the Eurobarometer polls, that there is evidence of that, so it's tracked. It's not just a question of my own opinion, it's established opinion. I think the response is complicated by the fact of what Europe can do and what it can't do. I think Europe's toolbox was empty, frankly, when they went looking for the right tools, and the guys who had to give it the tools were the member states. And that complication is part answered, but part unanswered, and it remains the defining challenge to do with overcoming the crisis and not just containing the crisis.
One of the problems was that perhaps the whole single currency thing hadn't really been created with a view to crises ever arising.
I think when the original rule book of what was acceptable was established, the rules on budget management were clear. The idea of the common interest was mentioned in the treaty. But the truth is that the ECOFIN ministers, when people started cheating, starting with the big boys, engaged in a policy of lax mutual comprehension, did nothing, because each knew it would be their own turn to be in the firing line, and doing nothing costed, and in the end exposed the fact that that was not sufficiently rigorous to sustain what was required in a monetary union.
OK, well, more time for that in just a moment, but we're going to have a look at the week's events now in brief with Paul Anderson.
How to protect the poorest of the poor. Those suffering severe deprivation number around 40 million, among them the homeless, unemployed, elderly and people with disabilities, as well as large families. A scheme started in 1987, putting EU food surpluses to good use, will expire in 6 months. Next week, MEPs will vote on the terms of a replacement, focused on the homeless and children. The fund will be €2.5 billion spread over 7 years. Wildly inadequate, says one MEP steering the issue through Parliament, but a contribution nonetheless to fighting poverty and social exclusion. MEPs want to accelerate the fight against organised crime, money laundering and fraud. Among a swathe of proposals to emerge from Parliament's Special Committee on Organised Crime is to establish an EU public prosecutor to combat, investigate, prosecute and bring to trial crimes affecting the EU's financial interests. The prosecutor would also coordinate and encourage national investigations and interact with EU institutions such as Europol and OLAF, Europe's anti-fraud office. The proposal will be voted on at plenary. Also on the agenda are 2 measures central to common asylum procedures across the EU, designed to make the assessment and reception of asylum seekers fairer. One concerns the granting or withdrawing of international protection for asylum seekers within a period of 6 months. The second concerns the fight against terrorism, allowing national police and Europol access to data stored by Eurodac, the European fingerprint database used to identify asylum seekers and people crossing EU borders illegally.
Pat Cox, during the yes-no sequence, you mentioned Turkey, and you said that the EU's attitude to Turkey had been disgraceful. Looking at the neighbourhood, as it were, in the wider world, you've been to Ukraine several times, I know, to try to sort out EU attitudes towards the cases of Yulia Tymoshenko and others. What is the state of play on the ground there? What do you think the EU should be doing about it?
The EU-Ukrainian relationship went into a deep freeze after the various cases of so-called selective justice, which saw Mrs. Tymoshenko, Mr. Lutsenko and other ministers in prison. And an initiative was taken here 1 year ago exactly by President Schulz of the European Parliament with Prime Minister Azarov of Ukraine to establish a high-level political mission led by President Kwasniewski and myself. We've now done 16 mission visits. Three of the four ministers, ex-ministers who were in prison are now out, and I think that the mission has been critical to achieving that. We're focused very heavily on trying to move on the situation with Mrs. Tymoshenko, and we've a very wide range of discussion also about legal reforms. Basically, I would say, if the reforms that are necessary and that have been indicated by the European Union now for 2 full years are put on the table, and I think there is a will in Ukraine to do this, and if we can sort out the remaining issues on selective justice, I would be hopeful that we would have a signature in Vilnius of an association agreement. It's on the way, but it's not yet over the line. I think Ukraine is a country that is on a journey it's in a post-Soviet transition, and if you take the wider region of other states that are going through that transition, it is, in terms of what we would recognise as being more European, certainly more advanced in its transition journey, but there's a journey still to be made, of course.
Now, since you were President of the European Parliament a long time ago, I remember 5 months before, you said you didn't think you had a snowball's chance in hell, you put it, as far as I can recall, of being elected, but of course you were. Europe has changed, though. We are seeing a rise of populist parties now and attitudes, anti-immigration attitudes, this sort of thing. Is that a concern for you, because you're still a committed European?
It is a concern. I actually think a good deal of this, although it may focus on immigration and so on, I think a good deal of it is related to the economic crisis. It's related to a sense, I suppose, when Europe is working best, in a phrase, Europe equals hope. L'Europe c'est l'espoir is some way a motivator and an animator. And when Europe is not working well, or perceived not to be working well, its legitimacy goes down. And legitimacy has 2 forms. We have a big debate about democratic deficit, according to whatever definition people have of this. But there's another legitimacy, which is delivering the goods. And when you're not delivering the goods, you're losing your output legitimacy. And I think that's one of the elements in which the immigration part comes into play. But in fact, I think it's the malaise, the feeling that hope is absent, that is driving that. And that should be the motivator for those who believe that we can overcome this crisis to drive to find the appropriate solutions.
Just briefly, do you feel that the EU has rather mishandled this whole thing? It's tended to jump from crisis to crisis rather than take a grand approach to the whole thing.
Well, I think if we were answering the question, putting them in boxes, one box was the disintegration box, and that looked us in the face several times. The second box is the muddling through box. We'll try to we'll take out some plaster and we'll put it on the scratch. The other one is some radical surgery, and the last one is a very high level of federal integration. I don't know that we're going to go to the high level of federal integration box. I think we've been in box number 2, muddling through, and I think we're on the foothills of box number 3, which is some of the required surgery, like banking union, economic union, and all of these issues. But I think what we've managed to do is to contain the crisis, and that is not negligible. I think we've managed to avoid disintegration. I think that is significant, but we haven't yet managed to overcome and reverse, and that remains deeply challenging.
Well, let's hope we manage to get in the box before somebody slams the lid. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thanks very much indeed, Pat Cox. Great to see you again, and goodbye.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're watching 7 Days in Europe. I'm sure that most of us, when we travel by air, don't much care who checks in and handles our baggage as long as it ends up in the place we're going at more or less the same time we do. And I don't suppose we're bothered who fuels the aeroplanes or de-ices their wings as long as it's done. But a plan to liberalise ground handling services has had a turbulent flight towards becoming EU law. Ground handlers have staged strikes and demonstrations, and a number of member states are unhappy with it. My guest to talk about it is Georges Bach, a Luxembourg member of the EPP group. Welcome. Mais comme toujours, nous commençons avec les séquences oui-non, une série de questions à laquelle j'aimerais que vous répondiez oui ou non.
D'accord.
En tant qu'ancien employé des chemins de fer, est-ce que la privatisation ferroviaire a amélioré les services?
Non.
L'Union européenne devrait-elle faire plus pour encourager le transport des marchandises par chemin de fer?
Oui.
Y a-t-il encore des obstacles techniques?
Beaucoup, oui.
La langue est-elle toujours un problème pour les travailleurs ferroviaires transfrontaliers?
Non.
La signalisation devrait-elle être harmonisée?
Oui.
Les Verts disent que la libéralisation des services aéroportuaires créera plus de vols et des aéroports plus grands. Est-ce vrai?
Oui.
C'est bon ou non?
Non.
Comme ancien employé des chemins de fer, préférez-vous voir les gens voyager par le train et moins par avion?
Oui.
Un patron ferroviaire belge m'a dit que si les services ferroviaires en Belgique et en France avaient été privés, le service Thalys n'aurait jamais été créé. Est-ce vrai?
Oui.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Merci beaucoup. As I said, our topic of debate is ground handling services at EU airports and the plan to liberalise them. Just before our short report on that, Georges Bach, la Commission estime que la libéralisation conduira à une baisse des coûts et un meilleur service. Ont-ils raison?
C'est ce qu'on constate ce moment, c'est-à-dire il y a une pression énorme sur les entreprises pour réduire les coûts. Et réduire les coûts, ça veut dire d'un côté améliorer les services, et optimisation de l'organisation, optimisation des programmes, améliorer la qualité, d'accord, là vraiment on est en concurrence, mais on constate une forte pression sur les conditions sociales, pas uniquement sur les salaires, mais également les conditions sociales.
D'accord. Okay, more on that in a moment. Let's take a look now at this short report on ground handling services from Hugh Weinstock.
Raoul est un habitué des aéroports. Depuis des années, il traîne sa valise aux quatre coins du monde et de l'Europe. Aujourd'hui, c'est un départ vers le sud de la France pour raisons professionnelles.
Por cuestiones de trabajo me considero un viajero frecuente. He tomado el avión unas 150 veces en los últimos 10 años. Por lo general todo va bien, sin mayor problema. A pesar de esto siempre hay alguna que otra mala experiencia. He perdido las maletas en algún vuelo. Perdí una conexión en el aeropuerto de Madrid en una ocasión. Y en el aeropuerto de París me tocó una anulación de vuelo por problemas de nieve en las salas del avión.
Retard, perte de bagages, annulation de vol. La Commission européenne pense avoir identifié le problème. 70% des retards seraient dus à des incidents rencontrés au sol. Solution: ouvrir à la concurrence les services d'assistance au sol des avions. Le nombre d'entreprises chargées de l'assistance des avions passerait de 2 à 3. Le Parlement européen souhaite cette ouverture du marché, mais uniquement aux aéroports accueillant plus de 15 millions de passagers par an. Une décision que les travailleurs des aéroports concernés digèrent mal. Hasard du calendrier, à Bruxelles, ils sont en grève. Ils dénoncent une trop forte flexibilité des horaires de travail.
Als we spreken over chartervluchten waar veel mensen op zitten, dan kunnen we toch spreken over een hoeveelheid kilogram aan bagage die varieert tussen de 1000 kilogram en de 3000 kilogram. Nu, voor dergelijke grote hoeveelheden bagage werden er dus vroeger 4 mensen ingezet om deze hoeveelheid bagage te lossen. Nu zet men daar een ploeg in die 50% kleiner is.
Les travailleurs seraient les perdants de cette mise en concurrence, mais qui en seraient les gagnants?
I think one of the biggest issues for us for opening up the market is indeed that the costs for the airlines will decrease. There will be more choice for the airlines to choose from various service providers at the airport, so there will be more competitive pressure on the ground handlers at airports. We believe that it will be good because it will decrease our costs, it will increase our service level, not only for the airlines, but also for the customers and our passengers.
Londres, Paris, Amsterdam sont quelques aéroports qui ont déjà anticipé cette ouverture du marché. Les détracteurs prétendent que cela n'a pas amélioré la qualité des services. Parlement européen et États membres devront se mettre d'accord sur le dossier lors d'un deuxième round de négociations.
En quoi la libéralisation des services aéroportuaires serait-elle une amélioration pour les aéroports et les compagnies aériennes?
Ça peut être une augmentation vraiment de la qualité si on fait des standards minimums, c'est-à-dire il faut augmenter la qualité et la sécurité, il faut vraiment mettre des standards très hauts, mais du point de vue personnel, du point de vue salarié, il faut vraiment faire attention parce que la pression sur les coûts de salaire, sur les conditions de travail va augmenter. Et là également, il faut mettre des standards minimums pour que le personnel soit en sécurité.
Et c'est mieux aussi pour les passagers?
Pour les passagers ne seront pas contre. C'est-à-dire pour les passagers, il y a le service, il y a le prix, mais ils ne pensent pas aux conditions de travail, ils ne pensent pas aux conditions salariales des employés.
Est-ce que la mise en concurrence de ces sociétés risque de concurrence et de la faire baisser les salaires ainsi que les normes de sécurité de service?
Oui, exactement. C'est ce qu'on constate ces derniers temps, c'est-à-dire il y a une pression. On a un marché de travail énorme, il y a du chômage partout, c'est-à-dire la main-d'œuvre est là, et la main-d'œuvre accepte presque un job à tout prix. Et c'est ça ce qui est dangereux, c'est-à-dire il faut, dans ce secteur, c'est un secteur à haute sécurité, il faut vraiment une bonne formation du personnel, de bonnes conditions de travail et des salaires acceptables.
Les bagagistes à l'aéroport de Bruxelles se sont mis en grève à propos du manque du personnel, les horaires fractionnés et de la réduction des coûts par l'employeur. Ils craignent que les propositions actuelles ne fassent qu'empirer les choses. Ont-ils raison peut-être?
Pas tout à fait, parce que on est en train de discuter, on est en train de négocier justement sur ces conditions. Pour avoir dans un deuxième round, il faut vraiment fixer des standards minimums et également lorsqu'une entreprise va perdre sa prestation, il y a une autre entreprise qui va continuer le contrat et il doit embaucher le personnel à des mêmes conditions. Et ça c'est pour nous, dans le comité emploi, c'était une question très, très importante pour que le personnel a quand même une certaine sécurité d'être repris à des conditions acceptables.
Est-ce qu'il y a un risque de dumping social, faire venir des travailleurs étrangers avec des salaires plus bas?
Oui, il existe ce risque, mais pas uniquement. On a une grande main-d'œuvre, on a un grand choix maintenant et les gens sont presque prêts à accepter tout. Mais c'est justement pour ça que le Parlement et le comité emploi a vraiment avec ardeur forcé les standards minimums, c'est-à-dire il faut pas que la concurrence se joue sur le dos des salariés. La concurrence, d'accord, mise en concurrence, c'est bon pour l'innovation, pour la recherche, pour la qualité, pour tout. C'est-à-dire on avance, on s'améliore, mais pas sur le dos du personnel. Là, c'est vraiment ce domaine social, il faut le garder parce que c'est quand même une valeur de l'Europe.
L'Allemagne est un pays opposé au plan, ce n'est pas le seul pays. Pourquoi? Qu'en pensez-vous?
L'Allemagne.
Oui.
L'Allemagne, ils ont un système d'éducation, un système de formation. Ils ont une autre culture et pour eux et pour moi personnellement également, c'est-à-dire c'est pas la concurrence en fait la concurrence pour le moment est déjà garantie. Tout le monde peut avoir 3, 4, 5 prestataires ground handler. Mais la Commission veut imposer encore plus, c'est-à-dire au lieu de 2, la Commission veut imposer un troisième. Et c'est là que ça commence à avoir des répercussions sur différents aéroports, à mon avis, néfastes.
Et l'aéroport de Luxembourg aussi?
Luxembourg, du côté marchandise, c'est-à-dire du fret. Dans le passager, on n'a pas atteint le seuil, mais dans le fret, on est sur les mêmes conditions que les autres grands aéroports, oui.
C'est un sujet très intéressant. Georges Bach, merci beaucoup. Thank
Merci
you very
également.
much indeed. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.